It's no surprise, it's no secret that mainstream media has an immense effect on the narrative of an election and on the narrative of a person's campaign. But two recent headlines from Politico show just how far they're willing to go to distort news about Bernie Sanders. Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for stopping by again. I don't know if you guys saw this, but there were two recent headlines by Politico. I'm going to throw them up on screen, kind of one right after the other, and I want you to kind of tell me what's wrong with them. Now here's the first one. It says Harris-Warren tie for third place in new 2020 Dem poll, but Biden still leads. And then here's the second one. Bad news for Bernie has his backers getting antsy. So what's wrong with those? As you can see, the first one I read out, July 3rd that was published, the second one July 4th. So we're talking about things in very quick succession. And I know you've noticed this, that when there's good news for Bernie, relative good news for Bernie, he is literally excised, cut out of the headline. And when there's an article that's sowing doubt about Bernie's ability to win or the resolve of his campaign, debates about whether or not he's finished or not, quote unquote, that focuses a mainline story and he gets headline billing. It's very clear. The media is using the power of headlines to craft a narrative because they know so many people don't read past the headlines. These are the same headlines that you can find on Twitter, where a lot of people will comment on the tweet and like and retweet a particular tweet, but they don't always go to the link in question. Similar things can happen on Reddit from time to time. People read the headline, they don't always go in and read the article itself. So here in the first instance, we have them mention the leader of the poll, Joe Biden. We have them mention the people who are kind of in a tie for third and fourth place, Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris. But they don't mention Bernie Sanders. And they don't mention Bernie Sanders because it breaks down the narrative that they've wanted to sow the next day, which is that his campaign is failing. Bernie being in a strong second place position in the poll that was part of that first story, the story where they leave him out of the headline, complicates and it probably undermines the second story they list, which is that Bernie is failing and some people feel there's bad news, there's antsy Bernie supporters. And it goes to show that even though the pieces themselves may not have anything egregious, that the headlines can be used to paint a narrative that most people won't go by. And it gives Politico some kind of plausible deniability because people say, well, you didn't mention Bernie in the headline of your list of the top 4 candidates. Why'd you do that? You're trying to obscure the fact that Bernie Sanders is clearly the second place runner right now in that poll, and he's got quite a big lead over the third and fourth place candidates. And they say, well, actually, we mentioned Bernie in the poll. Don't worry about it. You're looking for conspiracy where there's none. And then they can make at least try to make the complainer look like they're, conspiratorial or what have you. And this is really troubling. This isn't just about Bernie Sanders. This isn't about Bernie in isolation at all. I do think that this is in part because Bernie Sanders is a challenge to the political and social and economic status quo. And because of that, a lot of mainstream media outlets try to ignore him when he does well and expose him when he does not, in a way they do not do with other candidates. But it's about more than that. It's about the media's ability to create narratives, both by what they cover and often what they don't cover, and how they choose to cover certain things. And I talked about this last week on David Dole's channel, where we talked about, bias in the Canadian media, how the NDP is often ignored in a lot of stories. Stories covering pharmacare recently, for instance, talk about the plan that the Liberals may offer, talk about the report from Eric Hoskins, talk about some of the groups that support pharmacare, but nowhere in those pieces did it actually mention, hey, Jagmeet Singh and the NDP actually support universal single-payer, available to all, no strings attached pharmacare. And the pieces don't necessarily have to agree with Jagmeet Singh, to be fair, of course not. No one's entitled for the media to agree with you. But by not giving the reader that information that, hey, there is somebody offering a plan here, and it's sort of the only party offering a plan like that, maybe that's newsworthy. And when you obscure that knowledge from people, you're effectively not telling the news, you're trying to create the news. When Politico writes headlines like these, They're trying to craft a narrative that Bernie is done, that Bernie is irrelevant, that it's a race between Harris and, Warren as the up-and-comers and Biden as the leader. And there's no one in between them. You teach your kids to count, it's 1, 3, 4. Number 2 doesn't exist. And it'll only exist again when Bernie Sanders is no longer in number 2, and then they can maybe reinvent the number. And who knows what they'll say if Bernie leads? Who knows what they'll say then if Bernie takes a lead in one of these major national polls? This is really troubling. It goes beyond partisanship. If you're a Bernie supporter, or if you're an NDP supporter, and you're a little bit ticked off, and rightfully so, that the media tries to create a narrative through a mixture of omissions and exposures. But it's really about the fact that we don't have an unbiased media. It doesn't exist. But because it doesn't exist, we have to ask about the media we have right now. And the media we have right now is against candidates like Bernie Sanders and Jagmeet Singh. It's against left-wing Democrats, and it's against the NDP, and in Britain it's against the Labour Party. There's no denying it. They don't want those parties to win because the owners of those newspapers, the interests that those newspapers support, are opposed to the interests supported by those parties and politicians. It's good old-fashioned class consciousness and class conflict. And the papers of the elite, whether they're right-wing papers, like the National Post here in Canada, or the Sun, or whether they're center-left papers, quote-unquote, like the Toronto Star, which are in line with the Liberals, the reality is that these sources do not like Democratic Socialists or Social Democrats, whatever you want to call them. So read these things carefully, go beyond the headline, and also expose stories like this. As I noted on David's channel, you shouldn't always assume malice with journalists that fail to mention Bernie Sanders or his plans, or Jagmeet Singh and his plans, or their, wings of the party and their respective plans. Sometimes journalists are under heavy deadlines, and they're trying to get out a story, and they have their own blind spots. And often when you discuss things with these journalists on social media, and not in a calling out sort of way, but in a, polite discussion, a reminder that this policy position exists, I find that more often than not, they're willing to listen. And they're willing to acknowledge their shortcomings. I won't name names here, of course, but some of the journalists that I follow on Twitter, some people that are very good, kind people, have made mistakes in their pieces, and I've noticed that once I've talked to them, they've done better. But there are times, like with this Politico headline, where it's blatant, where the bias is unmistakable. And in those cases, you should not assume good faith. You should assume there's an ideological or financial or political motive to, not noticing Bernie in a headline where he's, polling in a strong second, but writing a whole article headlining him as, failing with an antsy team behind him, not sure if he can succeed. So be vigilant, be respectful when needed, but don't be afraid to call out and to try to ratio pieces like these ones from Politico, because they deserve nothing less. Hey everybody, thanks again for stopping by. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I would appreciate if you like, comment, and subscribe. Doing so helps to spread the message, to let people know that the way Bernie is being covered, at the very least within the headlines of his stories, is not fair. It's biased structuring of a narrative, and it leads people to this assumption that he only exists when there's bad news. We need more people calling this out here on YouTube. Supporting me on Patreon helps do the same thing. It brings a left-wing voice to YouTube who covers both Canadian and American politics, often in support of left-wing visions for how we can build a better future. And that's a vision, I feel, that isn't always represented both here on YouTube, but also in mainstream media. So supporting me on Patreon helps to give that message extra voice and extra oomph. So guys, have a great one. Hope you're staying cool, and I'll see you in the next video.